Amidst the luxurious surroundings of a business-class flight, where everything seemed perfectly arranged for comfort and class, a seemingly small moment took the internet by storm. A black woman, calm and composed, was offered a VIP seat, but just a few minutes later, a flight attendant came over, bowed politely and smiled, and gently asked her to switch seats with a white passenger. There was no fuss, no argument, just a seemingly normal request. But what no one knew was that the woman was the mother of a famous black CEO. A short phone call later, the entire team involved in the incident, from the flight attendant to the flight attendant, was fired immediately. What really happened on that flight? Why did a seemingly small action spark such a huge public storm? And behind the CEO's strong decision, was it pain, pride, or justice being served? Join us as we delve into this moving and powerful story where motherhood, dignity, and justice intersect to create an unforgettable human lesson. If you believe that every human being deserves respect, share this video and subscribe to the channel to join me on the journey to touch the heart of truth. The boarding area smelled faintly of coffee and new leather, that sterile luxury only airports manage to have. Clara Johnson adjusted the strap of her handbag and smiled politely at the flight attendant scanning her ticket. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Johnson. Seat 1A. She nodded in thanks. Her movements were calm, measured. Everything about her spoke of quiet grace, the kind that didn't need attention. Her silver hair framed a face that had seen both hardship and peace. Years ago, she'd worked double shifts as a nurse, raised her son alone, and taught him that dignity wasn't something people gave you. It was something you carried, even when the world tried to take it away. Now, that son, Ethan Johnson, was the CEO of Vertex Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. His name appeared in headlines and business magazines, but Clara rarely mentioned it. On this flight from San Francisco back to Chicago, she was simply Mrs. Clara Johnson, a mother returning home after a quiet weekend with her son. The first-class cabin was nearly empty when she entered. The air was cool and still. She placed her handbag in the overhead bin, folded her jacket neatly, and took her seat by the window, 1A. The seat felt comfortable, though she hardly cared about such things. She looked out at the tarmac, watching the sunlight shimmer on the wings. There was something peaceful about airports. She thought all those lives crossing paths for a moment, pretending not to notice one another. I always wonder what people see when they look at me. An older woman traveling alone, a black woman in a place some still think she doesn't belong. The thought came and went like a quiet sigh. The boarding continued. Businessmen in tailored suits shuffled in with phones pressed to their ears. A couple whispered about connecting flights. And then came a woman whose presence seemed to shift the air around her, Victoria Langford. She was the kind of woman who looked at the world as if it were arranged for her convenience, early 40s. Perfectly styled blonde hair, tailored white suit, a diamond bracelet that caught the light with every gesture. The crew smiled wider when she approached. One of them even said, "Good afternoon, Ms. Langford, always a pleasure." Victoria nodded absently, glancing at her boarding pass. Her gaze swept across the cabin, and then it stopped. At Clara, at seat 1A. Her expression hardened disbelief first, then annoyance. She turned to the attendant. "There must be a mistake," she said sharply. "1A is my seat." The attendant checked the manifest. "Actually, ma'am, it looks like you're in 1B today." Victoria's lips tightened. "That can't be right. I'm a titanium executive member. I always sit in 1A. Clara looked up from her seat. Her tone was calm, her posture unshaken. I believe the seat belongs to whoever's name is printed on the ticket, she said softly. The attendant hesitated. Victoria's eyes narrowed. I'm sure she doesn't mind switching, Victoria said, her smile sharp as glass. It's just a seat. The silence in the cabin stretched. Clara's fingers rested on the armrest. Steady. You're right, she said. It's just a seat. That's why I'll stay where I am. It was the kind of answer that didn't raise its voice, and for that reason, it landed harder. Victoria blinked, caught off guard. She wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone who, by her standards, should have yielded. I suppose some people don't understand how things work up here, she muttered, her tone dipping into that familiar condescension that hides behind polite words. Clara didn't look at her. I understand perfectly, she said. Up here, the only thing that matters is respect. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the cabin returned low, metallic, indifferent. But beneath it, something had shifted. 2 rows behind, a man reading the Wall Street Journal glanced over his glasses. A young woman pretending to scroll her phone paused mid-motion. The scene was small, contained, yet it carried the gravity of something much larger. A flight attendant named Ryan Cooper appeared, followed closely by the flight supervisor, Sophie Adams. Both wore that nervous smile service workers wear when trying to appease everyone and offend no one. Is there a problem, ladies? Sophie asked. Victoria didn't wait. Yes, there is. I'm supposed to be in 1A, but this woman refuses to switch. Ryan checked the tablet. Mrs. Johnson's ticket is indeed for 1A, he said carefully. Sophie leaned closer, lowering her voice. Mrs. Johnson, perhaps we could move you to 1C. It's still first class, and it would help us avoid any misunderstanding. Clara turned her head slowly. Her gaze was calm, but firm, the kind of calm that exposes every discomfort in the room. If I move, she said, you're not avoiding misunderstanding. You're endorsing it. Ryan shifted awkwardly. Ma'am, we're just trying to keep everyone comfortable. Clara looked at him. Comfort built on disrespect isn't comfort, she said. The words weren't loud, but they silenced the conversation. Sophie nodded stiffly, as if unsure what to say next. I'll stay here, Clara added, then looked out the window again. There was no anger in her face, only a quiet steadiness, the kind that comes from a lifetime of knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Victoria scoffed, muttering something about people knowing their place. But her voice wavered. The flight attendants exchanged glances. Ryan's throat bobbed. Sophie forced a smile and excused herself, whispering something about checking with the captain. As the last passengers boarded, the tension in first class hung thick as the air before a storm. Clara reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and looked at the screen for a moment. Then she tapped a single number. It rang once. Hey, Mom. A voice answered, warm, professional, unmistakably confident. Ethan, she said quietly. I'm fine, but something's happening here you might want to know about. Her voice didn't tremble. It wasn't a plea, it was a report. On the other end, silence. Then Ethan spoke, his tone measured. Tell me exactly what happened. As she spoke, her words were few, factual, the way she'd once told him to stay calm when life tested his patience. When she hung up, she placed the phone back in her bag, folded her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes. I've learned that when people try to take your dignity, the best answer is to let them see they can't. Outside the window, the afternoon light shifted to gold. The engines hummed to life. Somewhere behind her, Victoria sighed loudly, still fuming, but the cabin crew now spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the front with unease. The flight hadn't even left the ground, yet something irreversible had already taken off. The last call for boarding echoed through Gate 14. By then, Clara Johnson was seated, hands folded on her lap, her phone silent again. The engines outside whispered like something waiting to happen. Across the terminal glass, a tall woman approached, heels clicking with precision, suitcase gliding behind her as if the floor moved to accommodate. Victoria Langford didn't rush. She didn't have to. The world had always learned to wait for her. Her presence was the kind people noticed before they realized they had. Polished blonde hair, designer white suit, an air that announced money, lineage, control. Her father owned half the skyline of Connecticut. Her last name opened doors before she even knocked. Victoria never thought much about privilege. It was simply oxygen to her invisible, but always there. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent without looking up. Langford, Victoria, first class. Yes, Ms. Langford. Welcome back, the agent replied, scanning the pass with the kind of careful cheer that comes from serving someone you'd rather not offend. Victoria smiled absently, already thinking about her seat, 1A. It was her ritual, every flight, every time. 1A was more than a number, it was hers. When she stepped into the cabin, the smell of champagne and leather greeted her. The overhead bins gleamed, the lights dimmed just right, wealth had a certain temperature, and this was it. Then she stopped. There, in 1A, sat a woman, older, black, composed. Victoria's brow creased. "Excuse me," she said, half to herself, half to the air. "That's strange." She looked at her ticket again. 1A. It was printed clearly. She'd sat there on every flight for the last 3 years. The seat attendants even joked about it. "Your throne's ready, Ms. Langford." Yet here she was, looking at someone else, someone who didn't fit the image in her head of who belonged there. The woman didn't seem to notice her stare. She was gazing out the window, the kind of gaze that didn't seek permission to exist. Victoria cleared her throat. "I'm sorry. I think there's been a mix-up. You're in my seat." The words came out crisp, trained. Her voice had that confidence born from years of never being told no. The other woman turned her head. Her eyes were calm, deep. "I don't think so," she said. "This is 1A. That's what's on my ticket." Victoria frowned. She hadn't expected resistance, not this kind. "I'm sure you're mistaken. I'm a titanium executive member. That's my usual seat." The woman Clara smiled gently. "Then maybe it's time for a little change." The sentence hung there, unhurried but heavy. Victoria blinked. "Excuse me," Clara looked back at the window. "It's a nice view," she said quietly. For a heartbeat, the air between them was utterly still. I've met that look before, Clara thought. The one that tries to remind you of where it thinks you belong. Victoria stood, half blocking the aisle. The passengers behind her shifted, sensing tension but pretending not to. She turned to the nearest attendant, Ryan Cooper, who was passing with a tray. "Ryan, there's been an error. Someone's in my seat." Ryan froze. He recognized her. Of course he did. Victoria Langford flew this route monthly. She tipped well, complained often, and her father's foundation funded one of the airline's scholarship programs. Let me check. Ms. Langford. He pulled out his tablet. Seat 1A is reserved for Mrs. Clara Johnson. Victoria's tone sharpened. Well, that's obviously a mistake. I always sit there. Ryan smiled carefully, the way people do when trapped between politeness and panic. I'm afraid it's assigned by the system, ma'am. I am the system, she muttered, almost to herself. Move her to another seat, one seat, anything. He hesitated. I'll need to ask my supervisor. From 2 rows back, Sophie Adams appeared, neat bun, precise smile. Is there an issue, Ms. Langford? Yes, Sophie. There's been a mix-up. I want my usual seat. Sophie checked the manifest. Your seat is 1B today. I don't sit in 1B. I understand, Sophie said softly. But the system can be fixed. Victoria's voice lowered, cold. I've flown this airline for over a decade. I expect a certain level of Clara spoke then, interrupting gently but firmly. You expect respect? So do I. It wasn't defiance. It was truth simple, direct, unflinching. Sophie blinked. Ryan looked like he wanted to disappear. Victoria's jaw tightened. I'm not trying to cause a scene, she said, which was exactly what people say when they are. I just think certain passengers might be more comfortable elsewhere. The meaning sat heavy in the air. The man with the Wall Street Journal looked up again. The couple in 3A went silent. Even Ryan's hands fidgeted on the tray. Clara's voice remained calm. I'm comfortable here. That was it. No speech, no anger, just calm certainty, and somehow it carried more weight than any confrontation could. Victoria gave a small laugh, brittle, disbelieving. Well, she said, I suppose everyone's entitled to their choices. She sank into 1B, crossing her legs sharply, her perfume expensive, cold, filled the air. For the next few minutes, silence settled again. But it wasn't peace. It was pressure invisible, spreading. Sophie whispered something to Ryan before stepping back toward the galley. Victoria sipped her champagne, her every motion deliberate, as if reclaiming territory. Clara, meanwhile, sat still. She didn't need to move to assert her space. Presence was enough. I've learned that arrogance makes noise when it feels unseen. Outside, the runway shimmered in the late sun. Inside, power quietly rearranged itself. Victoria glanced sideways more than once, each time expecting to catch a flicker of submission, but Clara never looked back. That silence unnerved her more than any argument could have. At one point, Victoria leaned toward Ryan again. You should really consider seat reassignment policies. Loyalty members shouldn't have to deal with confusion. Ryan nodded weakly. I'll pass that along, ma'am. He didn't. The cabin door closed. The captain's voice came through the intercom. Calm, rehearsed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 782 to Chicago. As the engines roared to life, Clara closed her eyes. Somewhere deep down, Victoria felt a strange, unfamiliar discomfort. Not anger this time, but the creeping sense that the old rules weren't working, that perhaps, for once, her status didn't shield her. She reached for her champagne again, hand trembling slightly, and told herself it was just turbulence. The seatbelt sign hadn't lit yet, but the air inside the first-class cabin already felt tense. Ryan Cooper moved quietly between the aisles, setting glasses of champagne and cold towels with the precision of someone hoping not to be noticed. The engines were still idle. The hum of air conditioning filled the space like a warning no one wanted to hear. Clara Johnson sat in 1A, her posture relaxed, eyes on the window. Outside, a baggage handler waved an orange wand toward the plane's belly, and for a moment she thought of how many invisible hands made a single journey possible. So much unseen labor, so many stories underneath the smooth surface of luxury. Then came that voice, sharp, deliberate. "Excuse me," said Victoria Langford, leaning slightly into the aisle, her tone already asserting ownership. "I think you're in my seat." Clara turned her head slowly. She didn't rush. Calm people never do. "Your seat," she repeated, as if testing the word. "Yes." Victoria adjusted her jacket, her diamond bracelet catching the cabin light. "I'm a titanium executive member. I always sit in 1A. It's my seat." Her words carried the kind of entitlement that doesn't shout, it simply expects the world to adjust. Ryan looked up from the galley, freezing mid-step. He could feel the conversation turning, like weather before a storm. Sophie Adams, the flight supervisor, appeared behind him, sensing the shift without knowing why. Clara glanced at her boarding pass resting on the tray table. "It says 1A, she said gently. "That's the seat I was assigned." Victoria blinked, as if the simplicity of the answer was an act of defiance. "I think there's been a mistake," Victoria said, her voice tightening. "That seat has always been reserved for me. I sit there every time I fly this route." Clara smiled faintly. "Then maybe today's different." Her tone was calm, not mocking, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who had weathered far greater storms than this. Victoria wasn't used to being refused. Her entire life had been paved with polite compliance. Waiters moved tables for her. Assistants rearranged meetings. Hotels upgraded her rooms without asking. And now, this a black woman in her 60s, sitting where she believed she belonged. "I'm sure you don't mind switching," Victoria said, voice sugar-coated but firm. 1B is practically the same. Clara met her eyes. "I'm comfortable here. Thank you." It wasn't the words, it was the stillness that followed them. No raised voice, no argument, just stillness, and that stillness unsettled everyone in earshot. Ryan stepped closer, holding his hands together. "Ladies, maybe I can—" Clara raised a palm slightly, stopping him without even looking. "No need," she said. "Everything's clear." Victoria let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "You're serious?" Clara didn't reply. She reached for the small cloth napkin beside her water glass and folded it neatly. "I learned long ago that silence can be louder than any defense." Sophie stepped forward, her professionalism taut as a wire. "Mrs. Johnson," she began, lowering her tone. "Perhaps we could find another seat that's no," Clara said softly, looking at her. "You could, but you won't need to." Her voice was level. It wasn't rebellion, it was clarity. Victoria's eyes widened, flashing that mix of disbelief and insult that privilege feels when it meets resistance. "I don't understand why this is becoming a problem," she said. "I'm trying to be polite." "That's good," Clara replied. "So am I." For the first time, Sophie seemed unsure which side she was on. Ryan avoided eye contact altogether, pretending to check the cabin lights. Behind them, a businessman lowered his newspaper just enough to see. The young couple in 3A went still. The sound of champagne bubbles fizzing in the half-filled glasses became the only noise in the room. Victoria folded her arms. "Look, I fly this airline almost every week. Everyone here knows me. Then they'll know you can handle sitting in a different seat," Clara said gently. The words were like ice on fire, cooling, but impossible to ignore. Victoria stared at her, speechless. It wasn't the content of what Clara said, but the tone, no apology, no hesitation. It was the tone of someone who didn't need to prove she belonged. Ryan coughed lightly. "I can bring another drink if anyone would like, no." Victoria snapped, "I'd like this resolved." Her voice was louder now, sharper. Her image of control, the one she wore like perfume, began to crack. "This is unacceptable," she said. "I'm a preferred client. I have status." Clara's eyes didn't move. "Status doesn't decide everything," she said. "Sometimes it just shows how much someone still needs to learn." Sophie drew a quiet breath, then glanced toward the cockpit, as though the captain might offer salvation. He didn't. The silence that followed stretched too long, uncomfortable and telling. I could have stood up, Clara thought. I could have moved, smiled, given her what she wanted. It would have been easier. But every time we give in to arrogance, we teach it that it's right. Victoria sat back abruptly, arms crossed. "Fine. Sit there," she muttered. "But don't expect people to forget how this looks." Clara turned her gaze back to the window. "They'll remember," she said quietly, "but maybe not the way you think." Ryan finally exhaled, pretending to tidy something on the tray table. Sophie whispered something to him about filing a report, but both knew they wouldn't. Not yet. The engines rumbled outside, the cabin lights dimmed, the intercom crackled to life with the captain's voice announcing departure procedures. Yet inside 1A and 1B, the real turbulence had already begun. Victoria reached for her champagne, her hand trembling slightly. She steadied it, forced a smirk, and said under her breath, "Unbelievable." Clara didn't react. She didn't need to. Every word Victoria said only revealed more than it concealed. Somewhere behind them, a man whispered, "She handled that well." His wife nodded, barely above a whisper. "She always does," she said, though she didn't even know Clara's name. The plane began to push back from the gate, the hum deepening, and Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Not from weariness, but from something quieter, patience. I've lived long enough to know that injustice often wears expensive shoes. It walks confidently, convinced it'll never stumble. But sometimes it trips over its own certainty. When she opened her eyes again, the city of San Francisco glowed beneath the evening light. Victoria stared forward, pretending to scroll through her phone, though her reflection in the dark window looked older, somehow brittle. The seatbelt sign dinged. Ryan's voice echoed politely. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff." No one said another word, but the story had already begun to write itself quietly, like truth always does. The plane leveled at 30,000 feet. Outside, the clouds looked soft enough to rest on, though no one inside the cabin seemed relaxed. The hum of the engines filled the silence, the clinking of silver cutlery. The muted whisper of air vents all sounded sharper now, as if the air itself had turned into glass. Victoria Langford tilted her head toward Clara Johnson, her smile polite but edged with something colder. "I suppose," she began, stirring her champagne with a fingertip on the stem. "The airline's letting anyone into first class these days." Her tone was casual, practiced the kind of sentence said just loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to be denied. Clara didn't respond. Her eyes remained on the window. The world outside was vast and quiet, unbothered by smallness. Victoria continued, as if the silence had invited her. "It's good they're giving more people opportunities to experience premium service. Diversity, inclusion, all that. Very modern. Ryan, passing by with a tray, paused mid-step. His eyes darted toward Sophie, who was standing near the galley pretending to check her notes. No one said a word. Clara turned her head slightly, her expression composed, unreadable. "I'm sure the airline appreciates your approval," she said softly. Victoria laughed a brittle sound. "Oh, don't take it personally. I just think some people are more suited for certain spaces than others. It's about fit, you understand." Her eyes flicked down and up again, scanning Clara's simple pearl earrings, her modest cardigan. It was the kind of gaze that stripped rather than saw. Clara smiled faintly. "I do understand," she said, "but maybe the measure of fit says more about the tailor than the person wearing the suit." Victoria blinked. The words didn't sound angry. They sounded inevitable. "I'm just saying." Victoria pressed on, her voice slightly higher now. "First class has certain standards, etiquette, presentation. It's not just about buying a ticket, it's about belonging." Ryan shifted, clearing his throat. "Can I offer you something to drink, Mrs. Johnson?" he asked quickly, hoping to defuse the tension. "I'm fine." "Thank you," Clara replied, still looking at Victoria. For a heartbeat, the two women sat in silence, one armored with entitlement, the other clothed in composure. Clara's voice, when it came, was low, even. "First class isn't measured by skin tone or credit limits," she said. "It's measured by attitude and respect." The line landed without force, but with weight. It didn't push, it simply existed, and that was enough. A businessman 2 rows behind them exhaled softly, almost inaudibly. The young couple near the aisle pretended to look at the in-flight magazine, but were frozen mid-page. Even Ryan's hands, holding the tray, seemed still. Victoria sat back, blinking once, twice. "Well," she said, feigning a laugh, "that's a perspective." Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. I've learned there's a kind of silence that unsettles people more than shouting ever could. It's the silence that holds up a mirror. The engines hummed on, somewhere in the back. A coffee cup rattled against its saucer as the plane shifted through a patch of thin air. Sophie Adams finally approached, her professional smile drawn tight. "Is everything all right here? Ladies?" Victoria spoke before anyone else could. "Everything's fine. We were just having a conversation about seating expectations." Sophie's smile faltered, her eyes flicking to Clara the way people look at the truth they're trying not to acknowledge. "Of course," she said quietly. "Enjoy your flight." When she walked away, Victoria let out another soft laugh, trying to reassert control. "People are so sensitive these days," she said. "You can't say anything without someone getting offended." Clara turned to her again, her gaze steady, unblinking. "Maybe people aren't more sensitive," she said. "Maybe they're just less willing to be silent." Victoria didn't reply. Her face froze in a half-smile that didn't know where to go. Ryan quietly collected the tray, muttering something about turbulence, and stepped away. The cabin dimmed as the crew prepared the meal service. The golden light from the windows cast long, fractured lines across the seats, splitting them into halves of brightness and shadow. It was hard to tell which side anyone was really sitting on. Victoria crossed her arms, staring straight ahead, jaw tense. The hum of the plane pressed against her ears, the kind of sound that left no room for distraction. She told herself she wasn't upset that she was right, that she was defending a principle. But beneath that, something shifted. A small, quiet doubt, because for the first time in years, someone hadn't bowed to her version of normal. Clara picked up her book, a worn hardcover with creased pages, and opened it calmly. She wasn't reading. She was waiting. The flight attendants whispered at the galley door. One of them murmured. You could feel it in the air. The other nodded. Victoria sipped her champagne again, though the bubbles had gone flat. She turned her head slightly, eyes flicking toward Clara one last time. You must be used to attention, she said, voice quieter now. People watching you, judging. Clara smiled, without looking up. Yes, but I stopped judging myself for other people's comfort a long time ago. Victoria looked away. She didn't have an answer. Outside the window, the sky shifted streaks of gold blending into gray as the sun began its slow descent. The tension didn't fade. It simply changed temperature from visible to invisible, from sharp to heavy, and for everyone watching the attendants, the passengers, even Sophie from the galley door, it was clear. This wasn't a conversation about a seat anymore. It was about the invisible rules of who gets to belong, and what happens when someone quietly refuses to obey them. Clara turned one more page in her book. Her fingers were steady, her eyes calm. I've seen power before, she thought, the loud kind, the kind that takes up space. But real power knows how to wait. The plane cruised on. The tension remained suspended between the two women, like a thread stretched too tight to break. In the silence that followed, the audience, the strangers pretending not to listen, knew something irreversible had happened. A woman who'd spent her life sitting in 1A had just learned that not every seat was hers to claim. And another woman, the one who didn't have to prove anything, had just redefined what first class really meant. The flight had settled into that early hour quiet, the kind that feels calm, but isn't. The lights in the first-class cabin had dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the steady hum of the engines covered the silence that words had left behind. Ryan Cooper stood in the galley, his hand resting on a tray of untouched champagne flutes. He looked toward seat 1A, where Clara Johnson sat, reading without reading, her eyes tracing the same page again and again. Across from her, Victoria Langford stared straight ahead, pretending to watch the screen in front of her. The movie was playing, but she hadn't processed a single scene. Her jaw was tight. Ryan felt the tension pull at him like gravity. He'd been in customer service long enough to recognize at that delicate point where courtesy begins to break. He glanced at Sophie Adams, the flight supervisor, who stood beside the galley wall, tablet in hand, face lit by its pale glow. She noticed him looking. She's still upset, Sophie asked quietly. Ryan nodded. Yeah. Keep saying 1A's her seat? Sophie sighed. Of course she does. He hesitated. Should we talk to Mrs. Johnson again? Try to calm it down before it gets worse. Sophie pressed her lips together. We have to handle it delicately. Mrs. Langford's a titanium executive. We can't have a complaint coming from her. Ryan said nothing. He knew what that meant. It always meant the same thing. Keep the powerful comfortable. So they walked together toward the front cabin. Victoria turned as they approached, relief washing over her face. Finally, I was beginning to think no one cared about customer experience anymore. Sophie smiled, the kind of professional smile that never reaches the eyes. Of course we do. Ms. Langford, we just want everyone to be happy. Victoria gestured toward Clara. Then maybe you can explain to her that she's sitting in a seat that doesn't belong to her. Clara didn't look up from her book. "It says 1A on my ticket," she said, voice even. "So unless something's changed midair, it does belong to me." Ryan cleared his throat, trying to sound neutral. "Mrs. Johnson, perhaps we could move you to another seat." Sophie finished gently, "Just to make things easier for everyone. It's the same service, same class. Of course, we'd just like to avoid a misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding hung there, as though what had happened could be softened into semantics. Clara finally looked up. Her eyes met Sophie's first, then Ryan's. Calm, clear, steady. "I understand perfectly," she said. "You're asking me to fix something I didn't break." Sophie blinked. "That's not what Clara's tone didn't rise, but it carried enough quiet weight to stop her mid-sentence. "You're asking me to make someone else feel comfortable by pretending I don't deserve the seat I paid for." Ryan shifted. "Uncomfortable? We just don't want trouble. Ma'am." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Trouble for who?" The question was soft, but it sliced clean. Ryan's throat tightened. "For anyone," he murmured. "For everyone." Sophie added quickly, "Let's not make this bigger than it has to be." Clara looked between them, then said, "If I move, you'll be telling everyone watching that disrespect has a place in first class. You'll be saying it's allowed as long as it comes from the right person." Her words didn't accuse, they simply illuminated. And in that light, everyone saw themselves. Victoria scoffed. "Oh, please, no one's disrespecting you. You're just overreacting." Clara turned to her, voice low and calm. "You said some people belong elsewhere. That's not etiquette. Ms. Langford, that's arrogance dressed in manners." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. I knew, in that moment, that silence could no longer hide complicity. Sophie swallowed, glancing down at her tablet like it might save her. "Mrs. Johnson, I really need your cooperation." Clara leaned back slightly. "Cooperation," she repeated. "That's what people always ask for when they want to make wrongdoing look polite." Ryan exhaled slowly. He'd dealt with angry passengers, demanding executives, tears, threats, but never calm like this. Never the kind that made him feel smaller just by being near it. Clara's hands rested gently on the book in her lap. "If I move, you're not solving anything," she said. "You're just legalizing disrespect." The phrase landed like a stone dropped in still water. It rippled through the entire cabin. Ryan froze. Sophie blinked, her mouth opening, then closing again. Victoria muttered something under her breath, something about people always playing victim, but her voice faltered before the last word left her lips. For the first time, Sophie had no reply. She straightened her posture, adjusted her scarf, and said quietly, "We'll keep things as they are for now." She turned away, and Ryan followed, his face flushed with something he couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or awakening. As they disappeared into the galley, Clara returned to her book, but no one else in the cabin could read any more. Victoria stared out the window, her reflection staring back sharp, pale, uncertain. Ryan leaned against the wall in the back, rubbing his forehead. Sophie typed something into her tablet she'd never report. And the rest of the passengers, those who had said nothing, now sat with the weight of what they'd witnessed. There are moments, Clara thought, when justice doesn't shout, it just waits. The engines hummed, steady and cold. The flight attendants whispered. The captain announced turbulence ahead, but the real storm was already in motion, unseen, inevitable, and moral. by the time the plane began its slow descent toward Chicago. Nothing in that cabin would ever feel quite the same. The plane had settled into its cruising altitude. Outside the window, the sky was an endless gray-white stretch, calm, indifferent. Inside, first class had gone utterly silent. Clara Johnson sat motionless, her hands folded neatly over a closed book. The page she'd last read was already forgotten. Around her, the cabin's polite quiet was starting to fracture like a porcelain surface beginning to crack from within. Across the aisle, Victoria Langford was whispering furiously into her phone. Her voice was low but cutting. Words like unprofessional and unacceptable floated in the air like perfume, expensive, artificial, and heavy. Near the galley, Sophie Adams and Ryan Cooper stood side by side, speaking in the language of people who didn't want to take responsibility. Phrases like, "Let's just get through the flight and maybe she'll calm down," filled the narrow space between them. And through it all, Clara sat perfectly still, not defeated, not angry, simply still. She reached for her handbag under the seat. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She unzipped it, took out her phone, and looked at the screen for a long second. Then she pressed one button. The line rang once before a voice answered. "Hey, Mom." Ethan Johnson's voice, warm, steady, too mature for his 35 years. In the background, she could hear distant echoes of a meeting, the low murmur of male voices, the rustle of papers, the faint buzz of a city that listened when he spoke. "Hi, baby," she said softly. "I'm sorry to call while you're working. You never have to apologize," Ethan said. "Are you okay?" Clara took a breath. "I'm fine. Just something I think you should know." She spoke quietly, her words calm and careful. She described everything, the seat, the looks, the tone, the suggestion that she moved to avoid misunderstanding. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. "I didn't raise my voice," she said. "I didn't need to." Ethan was silent for a moment. Then his voice came, low and deliberate. "Which airline?" "Aerosky," she said. "Flight 782, Chicago route." He exhaled through his nose a sound she recognized. Not anger, calculation. "Who's the supervisor?" he asked. "Her name's Sophie Adams," Clara replied. "And the flight attendant, Ryan Cooper. Both polite, both afraid." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Clara could hear him moving a chair, scraping, papers shifting. "Mom," he said, "I'll handle it. Don't worry about anything. I'm not worried," Clara said softly. "But, Ethan, this isn't just about me. Don't turn it into revenge. Make it right." He smiled faintly on the other end. "You raised me better than that." "I know," she whispered. When she hung up, the cabin around her hadn't changed, but something invisible had shifted. The kind of shift that happens right before a storm begins, when the air goes still because it knows what's coming. Clara placed the phone face down on the armrest. "I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to remind the world it's being watched." Victoria noticed the call. She leaned slightly, her curiosity sharper than her courtesy. "You calling your travel agent?" she asked, the sarcasm smooth as silk. Clara turned her head, calm as ever. "No," she said. "My son." Victoria smiled tightly. "I hope he can get you a refund for all this inconvenience." Clara looked at her not with anger, not with pity, but with the kind of quiet that made even arrogance doubt itself. "He doesn't work in refunds," she said. The answer was simple, but the way she said it made something flicker behind Victoria's eyes, an unease she couldn't name. Moments later, Ethan's office in New York was no longer quiet. He stood by the window of Vertex Tower, city lights stretching below him like veins of electricity. His assistant hovered nearby, whispering updates into a tablet. "Sir, Aerosky Airways is one of our logistics partners," the assistant said carefully. "Should I contact their CEO directly?" Ethan nodded once. "Andrew Collins, personal line, now." He crossed his arms as the call connected. When Collins's voice came through, it was jovial and unsuspecting. "Ethan, it's been a while. What's new?" Ethan's tone was polite, but stripped of warmth. "Andrew, I'm calling because something happened on one of your flights, San Francisco to Chicago." "Flight 782. Collins paused. "All right. What kind of issue?" "My mother was on that flight," Ethan said. "She was asked to move from her assigned seat because a titanium executive member didn't like who was sitting in 1A. The silence on the other end was brief but telling. "Ethan, I don't." Ethan interrupted softly. "You know me. I don't call for small things. I'm calling because this isn't about policy. It's about culture. Fix it immediately." Collins straightened on the other end. "Of course, I'll have my VP handle it personally." "No," Ethan said. "You will." The conversation ended there, clean, final. Back on the plane, Clara returned to her reading. She didn't check her phone again. She didn't need to. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, sensing something but not understanding it. Sophie passed through the aisle again, offering forced smiles, her tone brittle. "Everything all right, Mrs. Johnson?" Clara nodded. "Everything's fine. Thank you." Her voice was calm, so calm that Sophie didn't know whether to feel relieved or afraid. Victoria rolled her eyes. "You'd think this flight was a movie," she muttered. Clara didn't reply. She turned another page. Outside, the clouds began to darken. The captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth but distant. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting light turbulence ahead. Please remain seated." The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The hum of the engines deepened. But for Clara Johnson, the turbulence had already passed. What remained was peace, not the kind that comes from avoidance, but from control. The kind that says, "I know who I am," and nothing you do changes that. Ryan walked past once more, offering a cautious nod. For the first time since takeoff, he looked her in the eye. There was something like respect there, maybe even gratitude. Clara smiled faintly in return. Just a small, human thing. "I didn't want anyone fired," she thought. "I just wanted someone to remember what respect looks like." Behind her, Victoria opened another bottle of champagne she didn't need. The pop was loud, nervous. It sounded like pressure trying to escape. And somewhere, 35,000 feet below, phones were already ringing inside Aerosky's headquarters. The morning light cut through the glass walls of Vertex Tower, painting clean lines across the floor of the 49th floor boardroom. Screens glowed, voices overlapped, and the city stretched endlessly below. Ethan Johnson, CEO of Vertex Dynamics, stood at the head of the table. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled up, eyes steady on the quarterly projections that scrolled across the monitor. Around him sat 12 of the company's top executives, men and women, twice his age. Used to running companies, but not used to being led by someone who didn't raise his voice to command respect. They were mid-sentence something about expansion into the Asian market when Ethan's phone lit up beside his notebook. The screen flashed a name he never ignored. Mom. He lifted the phone, excused himself quietly, and stepped to the far side of the room. The conversation lasted only 3 minutes. He said little, only listened. When it ended, he stood there for a moment longer, staring out the window at the city that buzzed beneath him, the same city that had taught him how power moves and how silence hides cruelty. When he turned back to the room, his face was different, still calm, but there was a sharpness now, a quiet edge. "Let's take a break," he said. The team exchanged glances. Ethan rarely interrupted meetings. He gathered his phone and stepped out into the hallway, walking toward his office. The glass doors closed behind him with a soft click. Inside, the space was minimalist dark wood, steel, the hum of technology in the air. A framed photo of his mother sat near the window. Her smile, small but certain, the same smile that had carried him through years of struggle. He dialed a number from memory. The call connected on the second ring. Andrew Collins, a confident voice answered. "Andrew," Ethan said, "it's Ethan Johnson." There was a pause, the kind that happens when someone quickly recalibrates their tone. "Ethan, my friend, it's been too long. How are you?" "Fine," Ethan said. His voice was low, even. "I need to talk about something that happened on one of your flights." "Oh," Andrew asked. "Which flight, San Francisco to Chicago?" "Flight 782. Andrew chuckled lightly. "You're not calling with a customer complaint. Are you?" "My mother was on that plane," Ethan said. The silence on the line was immediate. "She was seated in 1A. A passenger, one of your titanium executives, tried to make her move. Your staff supported that passenger." Andrew's tone shifted, the easy charm slipping into caution. "That's unacceptable. I'll have my PR team issue an apology right away." "No," Ethan interrupted. His voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "This isn't about an apology. It's about accountability." Andrew hesitated. "Of course. I'll have the crew retrained Andrew," Ethan said again. "Quieter now. Listen carefully. My mother raised me to believe that respect isn't a transaction. If she tells me she was disrespected, I believe her. But this," he paused. "This isn't just about her. It's about what kind of company you're running." Andrew tried to recover his footing. "Ethan, we've worked together for years. Aerosky and Vertex have a great partnership. Let me handle this the usual way. The usual way is why it keeps happening." Ethan walked toward the window. Below him, the city traffic moved in quiet patterns, cars flowing like data streams, each one a story of its own. "I want immediate action," he said. "Your VP of operations, your flight manager, whoever was in charge of that route. I want accountability on every level." "Ethan, come on," Andrew said carefully. "You're asking me to fire people on a call. Let me do an internal review first. You can review it afterward," Ethan said. "Right now, you act." The tone wasn't angry. It was the tone of inevitability. Andrew's voice lowered. "Ethan, we're partners. I don't want this to become public. It already is public," Ethan said. "It happened in front of 20 people at 35,000 feet. Every passenger in that cabin will remember who stayed silent, and so will I." Andrew's breath caught, faint but audible. "I'll take care of it," he said finally. "Immediately." "Good." Ethan's eyes shifted back to the photo on his desk. "And, Andrew, don't think this is about influence or leverage. It's not. It's about decency. And you don't need a PR department to teach you that." When he hung up, the office was quiet again. Only the sound of the air conditioning and the distant hum of the city filled the room. He placed the phone down carefully beside the photo. For a moment, his shoulders softened. The mask of the CEO fell away, and he was just a son, a boy remembering a woman who had once walked home from double shifts so he could finish college applications in a warm house. I used to think power was about control, he thought. Turns out it's about choice how you use it when the world hands it to you. He walked back into the boardroom. The executives straightened, sensing something different in his step. "Everything all right?" one of them asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes," he said. "Just handled something important." The meeting resumed, but he wasn't really listening. His mind was still on the plane, on his mother sitting quietly while others mistook composure for weakness. He knew better. The world always underestimated quiet people until the quiet turned into consequence. Meanwhile, on Flight 782, the plane's intercom buzzed softly. Passengers glanced up. A murmur rippled through the cabin as Mr. Richard Hale, the airline's regional manager, appeared at the door of first class. His presence was unannounced, his face unreadable. He spoke briefly with Sophie near the galley. She turned pale. Ryan froze mid-service. Within minutes, Hale stepped forward. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, bowing his head slightly. "I'm here on behalf of Aerosky Airways. May I have a word?" The passengers looked on. Victoria's expression faltered. Hale's voice was calm, rehearsed, but edged with respect that didn't feel optional. "We've been informed of a situation on this flight. It's being addressed." Clara looked at him the kind of look that weighed a man's intentions more than his words. "I see," she said simply. Victoria's hand tightened on her champagne glass. She didn't yet understand how fast the world can tilt when it decides to. Hale turned to Ryan and Sophie. "I need you both outside the cabin. Now." The two hesitated. Then, under the gaze of every watching passenger, they followed him out. The door closed behind them, and for the first time that flight, the air inside first class felt clean again. Not calm, but clean. Clara looked out the window once more. The sun was beginning to break through the clouds. "I didn't ask for justice," she thought. "I just stopped pretending it was too much to expect." For a long time, no one spoke. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like background music to something no one wanted to name. The tension had shifted, not loud, not explosive, just different. It had weight now, a gravity that people could feel but not explain. Near the middle of first class, in seat 3C, a young woman named Chloe Park sat with her phone resting lightly in her palm. She was 24, a journalism intern for an online news outlet in Chicago. Smart, quiet, observant, the kind of person who noticed small details before anyone else realized they mattered. When the argument first began, the seat confusion, as the crew tried to call it, Chloe had already been recording. Not because she expected drama, but because she'd learned early in journalism truth usually hides behind politeness. At first, it was just to protect herself. But as she watched Clara Johnson sit in that seat with quiet dignity, while a younger white woman tried to claim it with entitlement, Chloe felt something tighten in her chest. So she kept recording. She didn't zoom in or add commentary, just a steady frame, voices, faces, gestures, facts. And when Richard Hale, the airline manager, arrived mid-flight and escorted Ryan Cooper and Sophie Adams out of the cabin, Chloe had kept her phone on her lap, lens tilted just enough to catch the moment. No one noticed, Or maybe they did, but no one dared to tell her to stop. By the time the plane landed at O'Hare Airport, Chloe's phone held 15 minutes of video. As the passengers began gathering their belongings, Chloe opened her photo gallery, replaying the footage silently. The camera caught it all: the demand, the condescension, the way the airline staff tried to make disrespect look reasonable, and the calm, piercing dignity in Clara's voice. "If I move, you're not solving anything. You're just legalizing disrespect." Chloe watched that moment twice. Then she uploaded it, not to her employer, not to an editor, to her own social media account. The caption was simple. Almost journalistic black woman with valid first-class ticket told to move for white passenger with airline status. Airline staff supported the request. Aerosky, discrimination in the air. She didn't expect much, maybe a few hundred views, a small discussion, but within 20 minutes, the post began spreading faster than she could refresh. By the time she walked off the plane and into the terminal, her phone was buzzing nonstop. Notifications blurred across her screen like raindrops on glass. "Holy," she whispered. The video had crossed 50,000 views, then 100. People were angry, but not loud angry, the kind of anger that builds, organized, and focused. Lawyers were tagging each other. Journalists were quoting it. Someone had already traced the flight number, confirmed Aerosky Airways, and identified the route. Then came the comments from passengers on the same flight, people who had watched in silence but now wanted to be heard. "Yes, I saw it. That woman did nothing wrong." The staff looked terrified of the rich lady. She handled it with more grace than anyone I've ever seen. The internet, for once, wasn't mocking. It was listening. Inside the VIP terminal, Victoria Langford was fuming, pacing near the glass windows. Her assistant trailed behind her, whispering about legal contacts and publicists. "How the hell is this going viral?" Victoria snapped. "Someone must have filmed it. Find out who." But the damage was already done. Across the country, in New York, Ethan Johnson's assistant, Camille, stepped out of the conference room, phone pressed to her ear. The words came out fast, clipped, professional. "Mia," she said, speaking to the firm's chief legal counsel, "Mia Torres, pull the team together, now. We're moving this forward." Mia's tone was calm, already knowing what it meant. "Mrs. Johnson." "Yes," Camille said, "and there's a video. Viral." Mia sighed. "Then it's already bigger than a complaint. It's a precedent." Camille glanced through the glass walls, where Ethan stood at his desk, silent, looking down at his phone. On his screen, Chloe's video played without sound. He didn't need the audio. He recognized his mother's composure, the way she tilted her head when someone tried to intimidate her. He also recognized the faces around her: privilege, compliance, fear. When the video ended, he didn't move right away. Then he looked up, eyes calm but focused. "Prepare a statement," he said, "and call Aerosky's board. They'll want to hear from me before the media does." Camille nodded and stepped out. Back at O'Hare, the world outside the aircraft door had already changed. Passengers began walking out slowly, some glancing at Clara with quiet respect. Others simply nodded, the kind of gesture that said thank you for saying what we couldn't. Chloe approached her hesitantly. "Mrs. Johnson." Clara looked up, her expression gentle but reserved. "Yes, my name's Chloe. I just wanted to say you handled that beautifully." Clara smiled. "Thank you, dear. Sometimes calm is the only thing they can't argue with. Chloe hesitated. I should tell you I recorded what happened. I posted it online. Clara raised an eyebrow, but her tone stayed even. You did, yes, ma'am. People are already talking about it. It's everywhere now. Clara considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly. Truth has a way of finding its own audience. She stood, adjusting her scarf, and gave Chloe a small nod before walking away. The younger woman watched her go steady steps, unhurried, like someone walking out of a storm without ever having raised an umbrella. By the time Clara reached the terminal lobby, her phone vibrated. A message from Ethan. Everything's being handled. Don't worry, Mom. You did exactly right. She smiled faintly. Outside the terminal's glass walls, reporters were beginning to gather. Camera lights flickered like insects at dusk. Passengers stopped to look at their phones, murmuring to each other. Some pointed, others shook their heads in disbelief. On every screen, the same headline was spread: an airline faces discrimination scandal after viral video shows elderly black passenger asked to move from first-class seat. The comments below told the rest of the story. Meet Clara Johnson, mother of Vertex Dynamics CEO Ethan Johnson. Aero Sky may have just picked a fight with the wrong woman. Somewhere in Chicago traffic, Chloe Park sat in the back of a rideshare, watching her follower count climb by the second. She didn't feel triumphant, just quiet. She replayed Clara's voice again. If I move, you're legalizing disrespect. It wasn't just a line. It was a lesson. And Chloe knew she hadn't just captured a story. She'd captured a shift. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive in sirens or courts. Sometimes it starts with someone who refuses to move and a witness brave enough to press record. The plane was already parked at the gate, but no one stood up. The seatbelt sign blinked off with its soft ding. Yet the passengers in first class remained still, eyes darting between the aisle and Victoria Langford, who now stood halfway out of her seat, voice trembling with outrage and performance. I was harassed, she declared, clutching her purse as if it were evidence. This woman's been aggressive with me from the start. I was just trying to sit in my assigned seat. Her words hung in the air, sharp and trembling. For a second, they almost sounded convincing, the same tone people used when they'd spent their whole lives being believed before the facts were even checked. But not this time. From the middle rows, a man's voice cut through, calm, deep. That's not what happened. All heads turned toward Malcolm Reed, a tall black man in his 50s sitting quietly near the window of row 4. He hadn't spoken once during the flight. Not when the tension rose, not when the whispers started, not even when Clara was told to move, until now. He placed his book on the armrest, looked at Victoria, and spoke again, slow, measured, with the tone of someone who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. I watched the whole thing. He said, You tried to take that lady's seat. She didn't say a word out of line. Victoria blinked, stunned for a moment. Excuse me, but you don't know what you saw. Malcolm's gaze didn't shift. I know exactly what I saw. The quiet strength in his voice carried more authority than any shouting could. Then another voice joined in, a woman 2 rows back, still buckled in. Yeah, he's right. You were yelling at her. We all saw it. Someone else spoke up. You told her she didn't belong in first class. I heard it. And another, don't try to spin it now. The video's online. The murmurs built like a slow tide quiet, firm, unstoppable. Victoria turned, scanning the faces around her. The certainty she'd always worn like armor began to crack. "You people don't understand," she said, voice shaking now. "I'm a frequent flyer. I fly this route every month. That seat's always. It's not your seat," Malcolm interrupted, evenly. "It's a seat. You buy a ticket, you sit down, you don't own airspace." There was a ripple of quiet laughter from somewhere behind him. Not mocking, just the kind of laughter that breaks tension when the truth finally lands. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed. Even the flight attendants, standing frozen near the door, didn't move to support her. Sophie Adams' hands twisted around her clipboard. Ryan Cooper stared at the floor, shame written in the curve of his shoulders. Clara hadn't spoken. She sat where she'd always been, hands folded, gaze fixed on the aisle. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth had already found its own voice. Outside the cabin door, Richard Hale was on his phone, speaking in low tones to Aerosky's corporate office. "Yes, sir. We're handling it now. The situation's contained." But even as he said the words, he could hear the shifting mood inside the plane, the passengers reclaiming the story before the company could script it. "Contained," he repeated quietly, though he wasn't sure anymore who was containing who. Back in the cabin, Victoria was still trying to speak, but her sentences came out in fragments. This is reverse discrimination. I was the one treated unfairly. Everyone's ganging up a woman in 2D, silver hair, late 60s, interrupted gently. "Honey, I've been flying for 40 years. Nobody here mistreated you. You did that all by yourself." The cabin fell silent again, not out of tension, but finality. Victoria's face flushed deep red. She reached for her bag, but her hands were trembling. Her phone buzzed on the tray table. She picked it up, hoping for rescue, but her expression changed when she saw the screen. Her own face, frozen mid-argument, was already circulating online. The caption beneath it was mercilessly simple: "Privilege caught on camera." Someone had tagged Aerosky. Someone else had added Clara Johnson. Her hand dropped to her lap. Malcolm leaned back in his seat. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply opened his book again as if the world had already said enough. There was something powerful about his stillness, the kind of quiet that carried authority because it didn't beg to be recognized. I've learned that some men command rooms not by speaking louder, but by giving truth a place to breathe. Ryan finally looked up, meeting Clara's eyes for the first time since takeoff. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe "I'm sorry," but the words never came. Instead, he nodded, barely noticeable. Clara returned the gesture, small, forgiving, but distant. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while security assists a passenger." Victoria closed her eyes. "You can't be serious," she muttered. Two uniformed officers stepped onto the plane. They didn't raise their voices, didn't announce anything. They simply stood beside her row and waited. "Ma'am," one of them said quietly, "we need you to come with us." She hesitated, then looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would defend her. But no one did. Even the silence of strangers can become a verdict. Victoria gathered her things and stood, every movement stiff with disbelief. She walked past Clara without meeting her eyes. Clara didn't move, didn't flinch. The officers guided Victoria toward the exit. The heels of her shoes clicked softly on the aisle floor, once sharp and confident, now oddly fragile. When the door closed behind her, A strange calm filled the space she left behind. No applause, no cheering, just quiet understanding. A woman in 5A whispered, "About time." Someone else murmured, "Justice doesn't always need noise." Clara exhaled slowly. Not relief, something quieter. Resolution, maybe. Malcolm looked up from his book, met her gaze, and nodded once. It was the kind of acknowledgement between people who understood that dignity was its own language. Outside, through the cabin windows, the sun had begun to break through the clouds. The light landed on Clara's hands, steady, composed, human, and as passengers finally began standing, collecting their things, there was a feeling none of them could quite name, as if they'd all witnessed something important. Not a scandal, not a spectacle, a shift. The cabin should have been quiet. The flight was over. The door to the jet bridge had opened, and the faint hum of the airport filtered in. But Victoria Langford was not ready to let go. She stood in the aisle, her voice rising and breaking like static through the air. "You think you can humiliate me like this? I'll have every one of you fired." Her face was flushed, her posture rigid. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, or maybe she was speaking to the world that had always listened before. Now, it didn't. Around her, passengers stayed seated. Eyes followed her, but not with sympathy. There was no softening in their stares, no polite nods to preserve her pride, only silence, the kind that makes you aware of how small your voice sounds when it no longer matters. Clara Johnson sat in 1A, still buckled, hands resting calmly on her lap. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. I've seen anger before, Clara thought. It burns loud, but it burns out fast. Victoria's fury was losing oxygen. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Victoria shouted, turning toward the nearest attendant. "I'm a titanium executive member. I pay for this airline to exist." Ryan Cooper stood frozen by the galley. His uniform was still crisp, but his confidence had collapsed somewhere between duty and shame. "Ma'am," he began carefully, "please lower your voice." Victoria spun, eyes wild. "Don't you dare tell me what to do." "You people let her." She gestured toward Clara, voice rising again. "You let her disrespect me." Ryan took a step back. The passengers stiffened. It was Sophie Adams who moved first. She approached slowly, her voice low, steady. "Ms. Langford, the flight is complete. I need you to step off the aircraft." Victoria laughed short, brittle. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere until someone apologizes to me." "And you," she said, pointing at Clara, "you're going to regret this. I'll sue this airline into the ground." Her words hit the air like sparks, but the room had already gone cold. Clara finally lifted her eyes, calm and unwavering. "I think you've said enough," she said softly. Victoria's hand twitched a flash of something uncontrolled. She reached out, shoving past Ryan as she tried to step closer. That was the moment. Everything stopped. Ryan stumbled back. Sophie raised her arm instinctively. A few gasps echoed through the cabin. Within seconds, 2 uniformed airport security officers appeared at the door. Behind them was a man in a tailored Navy suit with an Aero Sky pin on his lapel. William Reed, head of Premium Customer Relations. His expression was carved in granite. He spoke first, voice even and professional. "Ms. Langford, please step aside." Victoria turned, startled. "Who are you, William Reed?" he said. "I'm with Aero Sky Airways. I've been briefed on the incident." Her posture straightened, relief flashing across her face. Finally. Someone who understands how this works. I was mistreated, and I expect William held up a hand. Ms. Langford, please stop speaking. The words weren't loud, but they landed with authority that left no room for debate. He continued, tone precise. We have reviewed multiple passenger statements, crew reports, and video evidence. You verbally harassed another passenger, used discriminatory language, and physically pushed a member of our staff. That's not true, Victoria snapped. They provoked me. William didn't blink. Ms. Langford, your titanium executive status has been revoked effective immediately. Your membership account is suspended, and you are permanently banned from Aerosky's elite program. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. You can't, she began. I just did, William said. The calmness in his tone made it worse. He didn't sound angry or triumphant, just finished. He turned slightly toward the security officers. Please escort Ms. Langford from the aircraft. Victoria froze, disbelief contorting her features. This is insane. I'll go to the media. William's expression didn't change. You already have. The words struck her harder than any shout could have. From somewhere in the cabin, someone whispered, "That's justice." The officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, please collect your belongings." Victoria moved slowly now, her movements jerky, mechanical. She gathered her designer handbag, her scarf, her shattered sense of invincibility. As she passed Clara's row, their eyes met one last time. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was a mirror, and Victoria saw herself clearly in it for the first time. For a fleeting moment, the arrogance cracked, replaced by something raw and frightened. But it was too late. The officers guided her down the aisle. The soft sound of her heels against the carpet was the only thing breaking the air. Each step felt like the punctuation mark on a sentence she had written herself. No one clapped, no one smiled. The passengers simply watched. When the cabin door closed behind her, it felt like the air itself exhaled. William turned to the remaining passengers. On behalf of Aerosky Airways, he said, "We sincerely apologize for what you've witnessed. Our company does not tolerate discrimination in any form." His eyes met Clara's. "Mrs. Johnson, we are deeply sorry for how you were treated today." Clara nodded once. "Thank you," she said simply. There was nothing else to add. Words couldn't fix what had already spoken for itself. William stepped out, leaving the attendant standing awkwardly by the galley. Sophie looked pale. Ryan's hands shook as he began tidying the aisle, though no one had asked him to. The passengers slowly began to rise, retrieving their bags. Conversation resumed quiet, thoughtful, subdued. Clara remained seated a moment longer, staring out the window at the reflection of the setting sun. The clouds were tinged in gold and gray beauty and shadow, side by side. I didn't want her punished, Clara thought. I just wanted her to understand. But maybe this is how understanding begins, when pride finally runs out of places to hide. Later, as she walked off the plane, passengers stepped aside, letting her pass first. Some nodded, some murmured "ma'am," and one older woman touched her arm gently. "You handled that better than most of us could have," she said. Clara smiled. "Sometimes you don't win by fighting," she said softly. "You win by staying still until the truth has nowhere else to go." When the cabin finally emptied, the air still carried the weight of what had just happened. It wasn't noise that lingered, it was silence. A silence thick enough to remember. Clara Johnson remained seated for a few minutes longer after Victoria Langford had been escorted out. Her hands rested lightly on her purse, her gaze steady on the space ahead, the way someone might look at the horizon after a storm has passed. There was no smile, no satisfaction, only a stillness that spoke more than words could. If she had been a different kind of person, maybe she would have felt vindicated. Maybe she would have wanted applause, or at least acknowledgement that she was right. But that wasn't Clara's way. She believed that when people lose themselves to anger, they also lose the truth they're standing on. And so she stayed quiet. Passengers began gathering their things, one by one. The energy in the cabin had changed. People who had watched in silence earlier now moved with deliberate gentleness, the kind of quiet respect that doesn't need to be declared. A woman in her 60s paused by Clara's row, her voice soft. "Ma'am, I just want to say, you handled that with more grace than I've ever seen." Clara looked up, offered a faint smile. "Thank you, dear. Sometimes the grace is the only thing we have left." The woman nodded, eyes glistening. "Well, you reminded us what it looks like." Behind her, Malcolm Reed stood waiting, his carry-on by his feet. He didn't say much either, just inclined his head, a quiet salute from one soul to another. Then he turned and walked down the aisle, steady and unhurried. Sophie Adams, the flight supervisor, lingered near the galley. Her hands fidgeted with the papers on her clipboard, even though she wasn't reading them. When she finally approached, she stopped 2 rows away, uncertain. "Mrs. Johnson?" Clara looked up again, her expression neutral but not cold. I just wanted to say," Sophie began, her voice catching. "I should have done better. I saw what was happening, and I hesitated. That was wrong." Clara held her gaze for a moment, long enough for the younger woman to feel both the weight and mercy of it. "I imagine it's not easy," Clara said softly, "but the right thing usually isn't." Sophie's eyes glistened. She nodded, almost in relief, and walked away. A few rows back, Chloe Park sat in 3C, still holding her phone. The video she had recorded the confrontation, the calm, the reversal was already making its way across the internet. But she wasn't thinking about views. She was thinking about the look on Clara's face when everything unraveled, that quiet dignity that refused to break even when surrounded by arrogance. Chloe knew stories. She studied them, wrote them, dissected them for meaning. But some stories didn't need narration. They just needed witnesses. She looked down at her screen. The video had already been shared thousands of times. Comments flooded in. She didn't raise her voice once. This is how real strength looks. Her calm was louder than that woman's rage. Chloe smiled faintly. The world was watching, and for once, it was listening to the right person. As the passengers deplaned, they didn't rush. They moved slowly, deliberately. Some nodded at Clara, others just smiled in quiet acknowledgement. Even Ryan Cooper, the attendant who had looked so lost earlier, approached her before she stood to leave. His voice was low, almost ashamed. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "I just want to apologize for how things were handled. You shouldn't have been treated that way." Clara studied him. He was young, maybe 30, but in that moment, he looked much younger. She spoke softly, but there was firmness beneath her tone. "Don't be sorry because someone saw you do the wrong thing. Son, be sorry because you know it was wrong. Then make it right next time." Ryan nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Then he stepped back, giving her room to stand. When Clara finally walked out of the cabin, she did so without hurry. Outside the gate, people were already whispering, phones out, watching the video Chloe had posted. Some recognized her from the clip and stepped aside instinctively, as if making space for something sacred. It wasn't fame. It was respect, quiet, collective, earned. And that's what dignity does. It makes people remember what decency looks like, even in a world that keeps trying to forget. In the terminal, William Reed watched from a distance. He'd stayed behind to file his report, but when he saw Clara walking past the waiting area, he stood. He didn't approach her, didn't offer another apology. He simply took off his hat, an old habit from when respect meant something, and gave her a silent nod. Clara returned it. Then she continued toward the exit, her stride calm, her shoulders straight. The story had already taken on a life of its own. Within an hour, the video spread across platforms. Elderly black woman calmly confronts racism on flight. But the truth was deeper than the headlines. Because this wasn't a story about confrontation. It was about restraint. It wasn't about anger winning. It was about dignity refusing to lose. By the time the plane's passengers reached baggage claim, people were already sharing the video with captions like, "This is what grace under fire looks like," and "The woman in seat 1A," and "Somewhere in Chicago." Ethan Johnson's phone lit up again, but he didn't smile. He just watched the clip, recognizing his mother's stillness like a reflection. He didn't see a scandal. He saw a reminder. His mother had always said, "Power isn't about who talks louder, Ethan. It's about who can stay silent without feeling small." Now, millions of strangers were learning the same lesson from her. At O'Hare's main corridor, the automatic doors opened to the late afternoon light. Clara stepped outside, feeling the cool breeze against her skin. The noise of the terminal rolling suitcases, distant announcements, snippets of conversation faded behind her. She paused for a moment, looking out at the skyline, and exhaled. The sun was lowering, staining the glass buildings gold. It wasn't a grand ending, no music, no applause, just peace. And peace, she thought, was the rarest kind of victory. Morning sunlight hit the glass walls of Vertex Tower like a blade sharp, clean, without mercy. Inside the top-floor conference room, the air was heavy with the kind of silence that only happens when people realize they're not in control of a story anymore. Ethan Johnson sat at the head of the table. The screens behind him showed headlines from overnight. Elderly black woman harassed in first class. Aerosky faces allegations of racial bias. Passengers' calm response. Sparks national debate on dignity. His mother's face was everywhere still, calm, dignified, framed by the chaos around her. No one in the room spoke. Daniel Price, Vertex's chief of communications, finally cleared his throat. "It's gone viral. Ethan, 24 million views and counting. Aerosky's getting crushed online." Ethan didn't look up. "I know. Are we issuing a statement?" Daniel asked carefully. Ethan's gaze stayed on the screen for a moment longer before he answered. "Not yet." He turned to his assistant. "Get me Andrew Collins." Within minutes, the call was connected. Andrew Collins, CEO of Aerosky Airways, appeared on the main screen from his Manhattan office. His tie was off, his eyes tired. The man looked like he hadn't slept. "Ethan," he began, his voice cautious. "I assume this is about the incident." "It's not an incident," Ethan said evenly. "It's a failure, a very public one." Collins sighed. We're investigating. We've already suspended the staff involved. That's not enough. Ethan replied. His tone was low, but every word cut clean. You don't have a personnel problem. Andrew, you have a culture problem. The boardroom went still. Collins straightened, defensive. Now hold on. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I'm not calling as a partner. Andrew. I'm calling as a man whose mother was humiliated on your aircraft. The people who worked for you didn't make a mistake. They acted according to what your system quietly taught them, that some customers matter more than others. He let that hang there. On the other side of the call, Collins' shoulders sank. He opened his mouth, but no excuse seemed large enough to fill the space between them. Ethan continued, his tone steady, surgical. You have a 5-year partnership with Vertex Dynamics. We handle your logistics, data systems, and predictive maintenance platforms. That partnership represents hundreds of millions of dollars. Collins swallowed. I'm aware. If Aerosky doesn't take immediate, measurable steps to address this training, accountability, policy reform, Vertex will terminate all contracts by the end of the quarter. Collins rubbed his temple. Ethan. I understand you're angry. I'm not angry, Ethan said, voice level. I'm disappointed, and that should worry you more. There was no malice in his tone, only precision, like a surgeon making a single cut in the right place. The silence that followed was long enough to make the air hum. Finally, Collins leaned back in his chair. All right, tell me what you want. Ethan's expression didn't change. I don't want anything for myself. I want guarantees for people like her, like the woman who sat quietly in 1A while your system tried to move her. Collins nodded slowly. What does that look like? Public accountability, Ethan said. A full investigation, mandatory bias and ethics training for all staff top to bottom, and an apology. Not a PR apology, a human one. He paused. Delivered by you. Collins hesitated. And if I agree, Ethan's voice softened, almost reflective. Then maybe we both get to keep our humanity intact. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Collins nodded once. You'll have my commitment by end of day. Good, Ethan said. And Andrew. Yes, don't do it for the cameras. Do it because it's right. The line went quiet. Then the screen went black. After the call, the room remained still. The board members exchanged glances, a mix of admiration and discomfort. Daniel broke the silence. You just forced the hand of a global airline. Ethan. Ethan leaned back in his chair. No, I just reminded them who they're supposed to serve. He turned toward the window, looking out over the skyline. The city below shimmered millions of people moving in every direction, each carrying stories no one would ever see. His reflection on the glass showed a man who held power, but not the kind people usually talk about. It wasn't loud, it wasn't performative. It was the power that came from knowing when not to raise your voice. I've learned that silence isn't weakness, Ethan thought. It's control. And today, control meant justice. That afternoon, Aerosky released an official statement. It was brief, clear, and, for once, sincere. We acknowledge the misconduct that occurred aboard Flight 762. We apologize to Mrs. Clara Johnson and to every customer who deserves dignity. Aerosky Airways is launching a full review of our internal culture and has partnered with Vertex Dynamics to guide our reform process. Andrew Collins held a press conference hours later. He didn't hide behind his PR team. He stood alone at the podium. No teleprompter, no filters. To Mrs. Johnson, he said, and to anyone who has ever been made to feel lesser by our actions. I am sorry. This company was built on service, but we forgot what that word meant. That changes now. In Chicago. Clara watched the live broadcast from her living room. She sat on the couch with a cup of tea, her phone buzzing nonstop. Ethan was still at the office, but she didn't need him to call. She already knew what he'd done as Collins spoke on screen. She didn't feel triumph. She felt something quieter restoration. When he finished, she turned off the TV and sat in silence for a while. The clock ticked softly in the background. I didn't raise a hand, she thought. I didn't shout, but somehow the world still heard me, and maybe that was enough. The next morning, a handwritten letter arrived at her door. No corporate logo, no typed font, just ink on paper. Mrs. Johnson, I don't expect forgiveness, but I do promise change. Thank you for reminding us what dignity looks like when the rest of us forget. Andrew Collins. Clara folded the letter gently, then placed it in her Bible between the pages of Proverbs. Not as a trophy, as a lesson. The press conference was set for 10 o'clock sharp. By 9:30, reporters had already filled the atrium of Aerosky headquarters in Lower Manhattan. The room was all glass and chrome clean, cold, designed to impress. But today, the light pouring through the windows felt different. It didn't flatter, it exposed. Rows of cameras stood ready. Reporters murmured in low voices, flipping through notes. The viral video had reached over 50 million views. Every major network had sent someone. Everyone wanted to see what accountability looked like when spoken into a microphone. At precisely 10 Hurrah, two men walked onto the stage. Andrew Collins, CEO of Aerosky Airways, pale, sleepless, but composed. And beside him, Ethan Johnson, CEO of Vertex Dynamics, calm, unshaken, carrying the quiet gravity of someone who didn't come for spectacle but for resolution. Behind them, the Aerosky logo glowed faintly on the wall, like a reminder of both prestige and failure. The first words came from Collins. He stood at the podium, hands resting on the sides, no notes in front of him. His voice, when it came, was steady, not rehearsed, not polished, human. "Good morning," he began. "Before we speak about policies, before we speak about partnerships, I need to speak about something far simpler: decency." He paused, exhaled. "Last week, one of our passengers, Mrs. Clara Johnson, was treated in a way that violated everything this company claims to stand for. What happened aboard Flight 762 was wrong, not by mistake, not by confusion, but by culture, a culture that we, as leaders, allowed to exist." A murmur rippled through the crowd of journalists. The words "by culture" hit harder than expected. Collins continued, "I have personally spoken to Mrs. Johnson. I have apologized. But I also understand that apologies are meaningless if not followed by reform, effective immediately. Aerosky Airways is instituting a full re-education program for all staff from gate agents to executives focused on ethics, empathy, and equity." He looked down briefly, then back up. "This company will not be remembered for the mistake that happened, but for the courage to admit it and the will to change it." He stepped back from the podium. Cameras clicked like thunder. Then it was Ethan's turn. Ethan didn't use the podium. He didn't need it. He stepped slightly forward, his hands at his sides. "Good morning," he said, voice low, clear. "My name is Ethan Johnson. I lead Vertex Dynamics, a company that's been proud to partner with Aerosky for over a decade. But today, I'm here not as a business partner. I'm here as a son." The room quieted. He continued, "When I watched that video, I didn't see a headline. I saw my mother. I saw a woman who's lived her life with dignity, who raised me to believe that respect is not a privilege, it's a right." He looked out at the sea of cameras, at the lenses waiting for something quotable. "Let me be clear," he said. "This isn't about my family. This is about every person who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere because of who they are, what they look like, or where they came from." He paused. "Dignity is not negotiable. It doesn't depend on a seat assignment, a last name, or a loyalty tier. It belongs to every human being who breathes." The silence after his words wasn't empty. It was reverent. A journalist in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Johnson, do you forgive the company?" Ethan's eyes softened. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give," he said. "But responsibility, that's something we all share. What matters now is what we do next." Behind the cameras, Chloe Park stood among the crowd. Her phone buzzed nonstop with notifications, the live broadcast streaming across platforms. But she wasn't watching the numbers climb. She was watching the shift in the room. The way people reporters, hardened by years of cynicism, had gone quiet. Listening like this wasn't just another corporate scandal, but a mirror being held up to all of them. She glanced at Ethan, then at Collins, then typed her next post quietly. When power speaks softly, people listen. After the official statements, a reporter called out, "Will Mrs. Johnson be making a statement today?" Ethan smiled faintly. She said everything she needed to say by staying calm. The cameras flashed again. That line, "She said everything she needed to say by staying calm," would replay on every major news channel for the next 24 hours. Later, off stage, Ethan and Collins shook hands privately. "I meant what I said," Collins told him. "We're rebuilding from the inside out. And I'm grateful for your mother's example." Ethan nodded. "You're not the first person she's taught something important to." Collins smiled faintly. "I imagine not." They both turned toward the window, where the city moved beneath them, cars, pedestrians, 1,000 small stories colliding at once. Power, Ethan thought, isn't about who stands taller. It's about who stands truer. That evening, the footage of the press conference aired nationwide. For once, the headlines weren't cruel. They weren't twisted for clicks. Corporate America faces itself and listens. Son defends mother, redefines power. Ethan Johnson, dignity is not negotiable. On talk shows, anchors quoted his words. Churches replayed the clip during Sunday services. People shared it not out of outrage, but admiration. And somewhere in Chicago, Clara Johnson sat in her living room, the TV glowing softly against the evening walls. She watched her son speak, the same boy who used to come home with scraped knees and endless questions about fairness. She didn't cry. She just smiled, a small, private smile. He had learned her lesson well. Later that night, Ethan called. "Did you see it?" he asked. "I did," Clara said. "What did you think?" There was a pause on the line, the kind that carries love through silence. "I think," she said gently, "you handled it the only way it could be handled, with your head held high and your heart steady." Ethan exhaled. "I learned from the best." Clara chuckled softly. "Well, I learned from life." They both laughed quietly. Then there was silence again, the kind that feels like peace. Outside, the world kept spinning, but something small had shifted in its orbit. People who had watched the story unfold weren't just angry anymore. They were thinking, reflecting, because every now and then, a single act of calm, a mother refusing to bow to indignity, can ripple through systems, corporations, even hearts. And that's how change begins, not with noise, not with revenge, but with truth, carried in silence. By the end of the week, the world had already chosen its heroes and its villains. The video, once a storm on social media, had settled into something steadier. A symbol, Clara Johnson, the woman in seat 1A, had become a quiet household name. Not for what she said, but for what she didn't. Television hosts called her a portrait of grace. Opinion columns spoke of dignity as resistance. Churches quoted her silence as scripture. And through it all, Clara kept doing what she'd always done, waking up early, watering the small hydrangea bush by her window, brewing coffee strong enough to hold its ground. The world was loud about her, but she never joined the noise. Victoria Langford, on the other hand, discovered what silence feels like when it's turned against you. The tabloids that once printed her charity events now printed her downfall. Heir to Langford Estates faces backlash over viral incident. Sponsors drop socialite after public outrage. Her name became shorthand for arrogance. Calls from friends stopped coming. Invitations vanished. The gated circles that once opened for her closed quietly, without warning. And maybe that was the cruelest part, not the outrage, but the absence. Because when power fades, it doesn't go with a bang. It just stops returning your calls. Victoria spent her mornings staring at the same laptop screen, scrolling through coverage she swore she wouldn't read. Every headline felt like a mirror she couldn't turn away from. In one clip, she saw Clara sitting in her modest living room, giving a rare interview. The host asked gently, "Mrs. Johnson, do you forgive her?" Clara smiled a small, patient smile. "I don't know her story," she said, "but I hope one day she finds peace, because anger is too heavy to carry forever." Victoria closed the laptop. For the first time in her life, she realized she had nothing left to throw. No defense, no influence, no one to reassure her that she was right. And that emptiness, that unbearable quiet, was what finally broke her. Across the country, in Chicago. Clara sat by her window, watching the evening light fall across the city. Her phone buzzed with messages from reporters, from people she'd never met, even from old friends who wanted to congratulate her. She responded to none of them. The truth was, she didn't want recognition. She wanted normalcy. But something in her life had shifted not in fame, but in purpose. She began receiving letters from people she didn't know. A school teacher from Georgia wrote, "Your story gave me courage to speak up." A flight attendant from Texas. "You reminded me that we serve people, not profiles." A teenage girl from New Jersey. "You made me believe calm can be powerful." Clara read every one. Sometimes she'd fold the letters neatly and place them in a small box beside her Bible. Other times, she'd simply sit in silence, grateful not for the praise, but for the proof that decency still meant something. Meanwhile, Ethan Johnson was back at work, trying to keep his mother's story from overshadowing her peace. His PR team wanted to spin the narrative branding campaigns, documentaries, partnerships. He refused. "This isn't a product," he said. "It's a reminder." He turned down interviews, declined endorsements. Instead, he launched a quiet initiative inside Vertex Dynamics, an internal fund dedicated to training leaders on ethical decision-making and social equity. He named it the Clara Fund. When asked why, he said simply, "Because character doesn't scale, it's built." Back in Connecticut, Victoria sat alone in her father's estate, the same house that once hosted galas and glittering guests. Now, the rooms echoed. She poured herself a drink, though it did nothing to calm the tremor in her hands. The news cycle had moved on, but the internet hadn't. Her name still trended only now. It came with hashtags like entitlement exposed and your seat 1A. She tried to write a public apology once, deleted it halfway through. Every word felt like an excuse, every sentence too late. In the mirror across the room, she caught her reflection tired, unfamiliar, stripped of the certainty that had once carried her. "I used to think power meant being right," she thought. "Now I know it just means being watched." Weeks passed. The world, as it always does, moved on to new stories. But the lesson remained. In classrooms, teachers used the video to discuss bias and humility. In business conferences, leaders quoted Ethan's line, "Dignity is not negotiable." And in quiet homes across America, people rewatched the clip not for outrage, but for reassurance that grace still had a place in the modern world. One Sunday morning, Clara visited a local community center that had invited her to speak. She almost declined public attention, still made her uneasy, but something told her it mattered. When she entered the small hall, the audience stood. Applause filled the room, but she raised a hand gently, asking them to sit. "I don't have much to say," she began, voice calm, unhurried. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refused to be moved by disrespect." She paused, looking around the room at faces of all ages, races, and stories. "I didn't stay calm because I wanted to look strong," she said softly. "I stayed calm because I didn't want to lose myself trying to fight someone who'd already lost theirs." The room went silent, and in that stillness, truth landed again quietly, gracefully, across the country. Victoria watched that same clip from her phone. She didn't cry, but her eyes softened, and for the first time in months, she whispered out loud, "I'm sorry. No one heard it. No one had to." Because sometimes redemption starts where the audience stops watching. Later that night, Clara sat at her kitchen table, reading another letter. This one was from a woman in Connecticut. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, careful. "Mrs. Johnson, I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say thank you. You showed me what grace looks like when it's real. You didn't destroy me, you reminded me what I destroyed myself." Victoria Langford. Clara folded the letter slowly. Then she looked out the window at the night sky, a faint smile playing at her lips. Some stories don't end in punishment, she thought. Some end in awakening. And maybe that's the better kind. The crowd at O'Hare International Airport moved like a slow river of suitcases, coffee cups, and weary faces. The PA system hummed overhead, calling out arrivals that most people weren't listening to, but Ethan Johnson stood still. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't surrounded by assistants or cameras or security. Just him, tall, calm, hands in his pockets, waiting. He had stood at that exact gate before, years ago, when he was a college kid flying home for Thanksgiving. Back then, his mother would wait for him, her smile lighting up even the dullest terminal. Today, the roles were reversed. and he realized somewhere between the buzz of the airport lights and the slow shuffle of passengers that time has a way of turning circles into mirrors. The automatic doors slid open. From the stream of passengers, Clara Johnson emerged, a small, graceful figure in a dark coat, her steps unhurried. Ethan felt his chest loosen, in the way it always did when he saw her. For all the noise around them, her presence had a way of silencing everything. When she spotted him, her face softened. No grand expression, just that quiet look of knowing the kind that only mothers have, as if they've seen every version of you and love all of them equally. He walked toward her. She stopped, and in that space between them, before words, before gestures, something passed unspoken pride, relief, love, and the kind of understanding that doesn't need to be explained. Then, without ceremony, they hugged. Not the kind of hug that belongs to headlines, but the kind that holds years. For a moment, the world fell away, the cameras, the headlines, the noise of the last few weeks. It was just a mother and a son standing in the middle of an airport, holding on a little longer than usual. When they finally stepped back, Clara smiled. "You look tired," she said softly. Ethan chuckled. "You sound like every time I came home from finals." She raised an eyebrow. "And you still don't get enough sleep." He laughed again, not because it was funny, but because it felt good to hear her tease him, like normal life had returned for a second. They walked together toward the exit, matching steps without meaning to. Outside, the Chicago air was cool and clear. A light breeze carried the faint smell of coffee from a nearby kiosk. They stopped near the taxi line. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "I watched your speech," she said. Ethan looked down, smiling faintly. "You did, I did," she said, "and I think your father would have been proud." He nodded, quiet for a beat. "I didn't want it to be about me." "Mom, I know," she said. "That's why it meant something." She turned to face him, her voice calm but full. "You handled it right, Ethan. You didn't fight back with power. You fought back with principle." He looked at her, eyes steady. "You taught me that." She smiled, the kind of smile that glowed more in her eyes than on her lips. "You always told me," Ethan continued, "that justice without humility turns into revenge. That real strength isn't about control, it's about not needing to prove it." Clara chuckled softly. "Did I really say all that?" He nodded, more than once. "Usually, after I got myself into trouble." They both laughed quietly. Then she said, "Well, it seems it finally stuck." They sat on a bench outside, watching planes lift off one by one against the early evening sky. The golden light hit Clara's face, softening the lines that time had drawn, making her look both older and timeless. "I never wanted to be anyone's symbol," she said after a while. "You're not," Ethan said. "You're just someone who reminded the world what dignity looks like." She glanced at him, thoughtful. "And what about you? You've become the face of every think piece about corporate ethics this week." He smirked. "Not my favorite title." "Then what is—" He looked toward the runway, where a jet disappeared into the horizon. "Just her son." "That's enough for me." Clara smiled again, quietly, proudly. A silence settled between them, comfortable, whole. She watched him as the last streaks of sunset washed the glass terminal in gold. "Ethan," she said softly, "you know what I'm most proud of." He shook his head. "That you never let power change what kind of man you are," she said. "You could have humiliated them, You could have used your name, your influence, but you didn't. You let the truth do the talking." He met her gaze, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Mom," he said, "I just did what you always taught me, that justice and dignity are the two things we don't compromise for anything." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening but steady. "That's all I ever wanted you to remember?" A plane roared overhead, rising fast into the orange sky. They both looked up, watching its ascent. For a long moment, neither spoke. Ethan thought about how strange life could be, how one act of prejudice had unfolded into a lesson for an entire country. How his mother's quiet composure had become a mirror that forced people to look at themselves. And how, through it all, she never changed. She never needed to. As they stood to leave, Clara placed a hand on his arm. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes silence isn't the absence of power. It's what real power sounds like." He nodded. "I understand that now." They walked toward the parking lot together, two silhouettes framed by the fading sun, moving in step, each carrying the same calm that had changed everything. Behind them, the lights of O'Hare began to flicker on, one by one, small beacons in the gathering dusk. And if anyone had seen them walking side by side, they wouldn't have seen a CEO and his mother, or a symbol and her legacy. They would have just seen two people bound not by circumstance, but by principle. Because in the end, that was the point. Power fades, headlines disappear, but character stays. The sun was setting low over O'Hare Airport, washing the concrete in soft amber light. The noise of engines faded into something distant, almost peaceful. Travelers hurried past, chasing connections, dragging their lives behind them in wheeled luggage. But Clara Johnson and Ethan Johnson didn't hurry. They walked side by side, their steps slow, unforced, like two people who had finally reached the part of a story where silence says more than words ever could. The evening light touched Clara's face, turning the silver in her hair to gold. Ethan glanced at her, not as the CEO the world now admired, but simply as a son, the boy who once thought the world was unfair until she taught him what fairness really looked like. And in that quiet, something simple and powerful hung between them, the kind of peace that only comes after a storm that didn't break you. If someone had been watching from afar, they might have mistaken the scene for ordinary, just another mother and son leaving an airport at dusk. But it wasn't ordinary. It was the ending to something that began not with noise, but with disrespect, and ended not with revenge, but with grace. Because what happened on that flight had never been about a seat. It was about the space people believe they're entitled to, and the courage it takes to remind them that every seat, every space, every ounce of respect must be earned by humanity, not hierarchy. Clara had no interest in reliving it. She didn't want her name attached to debates or op-eds. What she wanted was far quieter to know that somewhere, someone who once looked down on another person might think twice next time. And perhaps that was already happening. Across the country, the story had taken on a life of its own. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Churches used it as an example in sermons. Even flight attendants spoke about it in training a new kind of case study on respect. But for Clara, all that mattered was simpler. She hadn't lost herself. "I didn't win," she had told a neighbor once. "I just didn't bend." There's a difference, one that's harder, rarer, and truer. As they reached the parking lot, Ethan paused. He looked at the sky streaks of orange fading into soft blue, and then back at his mother. "You know," he said quietly, People keep asking me what this whole thing means. I never really know what to tell them." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe you don't need to tell them. Maybe it's something they're supposed to feel." He thought about that, about how, in a world obsessed with proving, explaining, defending, she always managed to return things to feeling, to essence. He nodded slowly. "You're probably right." She gave him that look, the kind that said, "I usually am." They reached the car. Before getting in, Clara turned back toward the terminal. Through the glass, she could see travelers moving in every direction, faces tired, distracted, alive. For a moment, she thought of Victoria Langford somewhere out there, hopefully beginning again. Maybe seeing people differently now. She didn't wish her harm. She wished her awakening, because Clara had learned long ago that punishment changes behavior, but only humility changes hearts. And that was what the world needed more of, not louder justice, but wiser souls. Ethan opened the passenger door for her. She smiled at the gesture, one he'd picked up from his father years ago. She settled into the seat, her movement slow but steady. He circled to the driver's side and got in. Before starting the car, he looked at her again. "Mom," he said, "you ever think about how strange it is that something so small a seat, a moment, could ripple this far?" She tilted her head, thoughtful. The small things are what test us most. Anyone can be kind when it's easy. It's who you are when it's inconvenient that tells the truth. Ethan smiled, quietly, as if filing those words away, the kind of wisdom that didn't need to be framed, just remembered. As the car pulled away, the city lights began to flicker to life. Chicago at twilight, restless, beautiful, imperfect. They drove in silence for a while, neither needing to fill it. The air hummed with something unspoken contentment, maybe gratitude, maybe both. And as the skyline appeared in the distance, Ethan said softly, almost to himself, "It's strange how calm can be louder than anger." Clara looked out the window, the reflection of the sunset glimmering in her eyes. "That's because calm is the voice of someone who already knows who they are," she said. In that single line, the entire story seemed to fold in on itself, the flight, the humiliation, the reversal, the reckoning, all of it distilled into one truth. When you know your worth, no one's ignorance can reduce it. When you stay centered, even the loudest injustice eventually collapses under its own noise. And when you choose principle over pride, the world has no choice but to listen, even if it takes a while. By the time they reached the freeway, the last of the sunlight had faded. The car's headlights stretched into the night, carving a path forward. In the rearview mirror, the airport lights shimmered faintly tiny, distant reminders of where it all began. Clara reached over, resting her hand gently on her son's. "Whatever comes next," she said, "remember it was never about the seat." He squeezed her hand lightly. "I know. It was about standing," she said. He smiled. "And staying." They both laughed softly, a sound like closure, like peace finally finding its voice. If there was a lesson left to tell, it wasn't written on headlines or etched in policy. It was written in the way people now looked at one another a little longer before judging. In the way flight attendants offered smiles that meant something. In the way strangers, for just a heartbeat, remembered that humanity doesn't come in ranks or colors, it just comes. And that's what this story had always been about. Not a seat on a plane, but a place in the world. A place no one should ever have to surrender to someone else's prejudice. As the night deepened, the car disappeared down the highway, mother and son. two silhouettes against a horizon washed in gold and blue. No music, no applause, just quiet. Because real justice doesn't announce itself. It simply restores balance and keeps moving forward. Clara Johnson. The story is not just a warning about racism or power, but an example of the power of calm and dignity. When offended, the natural human reaction is to get angry. But in the moment, Clara chose to stay silent. She won the real victory, not over others, but over her own anger. She shows us that dignity is not something others give us, but something we maintain ourselves. When you're treated unfairly, remember, you don't need to shout to be heard. You don't need to retaliate to prove your worth. Just keep calm and let your actions speak for themselves. In today's noisy society, Clara's story is a reminder that true power comes from wisdom and kindness, not from anger or revenge. Justice may be silent, but it always knows how to return when people choose to do what is right. If this story touches you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to spread human values, where justice does not need a hammer, just a heart and faith in humanity.